سلام زخبركم ناي تግራይ ኦንላይን ተኸታተልቲ ከመይ ቀኒኹም ደሓንደቕኒኹም ከምቱ ልሙድ ለማዓንቲ እውን ሕፅር ዝበለት መደብ ሒዝናልኩም ቀሪብና ኣለና ናይ ሎማዓንቲ መደብና ሓደ ሓዱሽ ጋሻ ሒዝናልኩም መፂና ኣለና ጋሻና ፕሮፌሰር ትሩንቮል ዝበሃል ኣብ ኦስሎ ናይ ኖርዌይ ዋና ከተማ ዝቕመጥ ሰብኣይ እዩ ፕሮፌሰር ትሩንቮል ናይ ዓለም ለኸ ፒስ ኤንድ ኮንፍሊክት ስታዲስ ፕሮፌሰር እዩ Professor Tronvoll بزعبا قرن افريقيا بفلاي كعاب بزعبا ارتران تግራይን ኢትዮጵያን ን30 ዓመታት ዝኣክል ብዙሕ መጽናዕቲ ዝገበረ ጽሑፋት ጽሒፉ ዘውፅአ መጽሓፍቲ ጽሓፈስ ዓሚቑን ገፊሕን ዝኾነ ፍልጠት ዘለዎ ሰብኣይ እዩ ብዛዕባቱ ኣብዚ ዝሓለፈ 2 ዓመት ኣብይ ኣሕመድ ካን ኣብ ስልጣን ካብ ዝመጽእ ዝካየድ ዘሎ ኩነታት እውን ብቀረባ ዝከታተል ዘሎ ሰብ እዩ ስለዚ نحنا لما عنتي بعيني وساعتنياتات اتي اب اثيوبيا اغاطيمو زلو ناي بوليتيكا قرولاو كما يرئ بزبل نزغاشا حيزنا لكم مصينا لنا تسع موداتا مدبنا ختكاتاتلو نعدمنا بقطا نفتو مس بروفيسور ترونفول زغبرنايو زررب كناتينا Professor Tronvoll, you have been following the Ethiopian politics intimately and closely for the past few years. And I know you have heard the Ethiopian Speaker of the House has resigned from her position 2 days ago. And the conflict between the Tigray regional state and the Ethiopian federal government and the rest of the states versus the federal government has reached its higher limits. As a peace and conflict studies expert, what do you think of the consequences of this latest development in context of the Ethiopian constitutional crisis and the latest Ethiopian political developments?
Yeah. I think, the resignation of the Speaker of the House of Federation is obviously a clear signal, and it was in the coming. Based on the outcome of the constitutional interpretation process, that the inquiry and the House decided to support the incumbent position and interests, the interpretation and position of the government. As such, the Speaker had a very harsh statement criticizing not only the outcome of the process, but criticizing the process itself. It will be interesting to follow that up more in detail, what part of the process she finds unconstitutional, as a statement said. It is a clear signal of a conflict which has been in the making for several months, has increased in intensity between the regional government of Tigray and the federal government of Ethiopia. And with the two opposing positions on how to interpret the constitution, with the two opposing positions on the elections and the way forward for the government in Ethiopia, it is difficult to see how this can be reconciled before we have a potential where this still rhetorical conflict might even turn into something else, escalating into into a potential higher level conflict between the regional state of Tigray and the federal government. As we know, the TPLF and Tigray government has stated its interest to conduct regional assembly elections.
Correct.
In order to uphold the time schedule as is constitutionally prescribed. And they state that it is safe to do so despite the COVID-19 pandemic.
Correct.
And if they continue and will actually implement regional elections or try to implement regional elections in September, it goes counter then to the decision now made by the House of Federation that both the Federal Assembly and the Regional Assembly are prolonged until the pandemic is over. So then it rests upon the federal authorities and the federal government what they will do in the face of a possible regional election in Tigray.
Yesterday we heard the Ethiopian government announcing they have suspended the Ethiopian election indefinitely. Means until the Ethiopian government declares there is no threat of the pandemic, or the WHO declares there is no threat of the pandemic, which could last from 1 to 2 years. After that, the Ethiopian government said it would wait 9 months to a year before it will hold the Ethiopian elections. Roughly, we are talking about 3 to 4 years before Ethiopia can hold elections. Do you think this would be okay? Do you think the current Ethiopian administration to run the country without being elected?
Well, personally, I have to say I don't have an opinion on the substantive matter as that, because that is up to Ethiopian institutions and Ethiopian citizens to have a concrete opinion upon. I am analyzing the different interests and the different positions stated by various Ethiopian actors in this regard. So that's not up to me to say if it is okay or not to postpone the elections for 3 years. What I can say is that the situation in Ethiopia is basically a political crisis, a legitimacy crisis of the way forward. And as we have seen, the constitutional interpretation process has not settled the political crisis. And that's what we have seen also in a comparative perspective. When you basically have a political discord to enforce a legalized process and a legalized solution to a political crisis is not helpful. The political crisis is still there because the legal outcome favors one side, basically.
Exactly.
And I'm not taking a stand to which side it favors. I just say that it's a one-sided decision. And hence, I don't see it solving the basic political crisis Ethiopia is entering. And I'm not only talking about the federal government versus Tigray regional state government. I'm talking about basic interests of Oromo political parties. The opposition, the OLF, OSC had a forceful statement today, and also other political interests and other regional states in Ethiopia are questioning this process and the way forward. So I think in a betterment of all of Ethiopia and all the citizens of Ethiopia, I sincerely hope that it will be an ongoing effort and an ongoing process of dialogue with all actors to bring on board a consensus agreement on how to move forward and how to bring the country and the people into an election process in due time.
As you mentioned it earlier, the Ethiopian government is applying a legal solution into a political crisis. And many of the stakeholders, the political organizations, political parties in Ethiopia, and generally the Ethiopian population is not on board with this solution. As a result of this, do you think there could be a full-blown military conflict between the states and the federal government? And what would be the consequences of this civil war in Ethiopia, in your opinion?
Well, I must say, if we assess the whole landscape in Ethiopia and the region of the Horn of Africa, you have several separate processes which are increasing in political tensions. Internally in Ethiopia, yes, between the federal government and the regional state of Tigray, between Oromia opposition and Oromia government in the region of Oromia, and also the federal government. between various other political actors in Ethiopia, all kind of centering around the constitutional crisis and the way forward for the election. But at the same time, you also have other conflict dimensions evolving as we speak. Well, the Ethiopia-Sudan issue on the border.
Correct.
Certainly Eritrea-Tigray. Eritrea's interest in Ethiopia. You have a new twist and turn of events in Djibouti. With the first time for many, many years, you have civil unrest or demonstrations in Djibouti, which also links back to Ethiopia. And you know the issue of the pilot, which was extradited.
Yes.
You have increasing tensions in Somalia, but also Ethiopia's presence in Somalia and possibly interference in Somali politics, at least as perceived by many Somali actors.
Right.
You have the issue of Jubaland and Ethiopia's interest there versus Kenya's interest. And you have also an increased tension between Kenya and Ethiopia. And then you have the whole South Sudan spectacle, to use that term. So you know, the whole region is extremely fragile in terms of political stability. And if you have a continued trajectory of the processes we see within Ethiopia today, if they are left unchecked, if the regional government of Tigray insists on conducting the elections and the federal government insists on the opposite, well, when the date is due, you will have a conflict. If that will turn into if that will be converted from a political conflict to a more serious armed conflict, well, I will not speculate in that.
Right.
But it is certainly with extreme concern, I, as an international observer to the political processes in Ethiopia, and I have never seen such a, how can I phrase it? I never seen, as a conflict researcher, I never seen so clear indications, so clear trajectories. If they are left unchecked, it will likely lead to armed conflict. I'm not saying it has to, but if they are left unchecked, if they're left unabated, if they are not mitigated and reconciled, that might be the outcome. And that might be a devastating outcome, not only for Ethiopia and Ethiopian people, but for the whole region of the Horn of Africa. Because if Ethiopia turned into a conflict scenario, that will gravitate the neighboring countries and the neighboring conflicts into that scenario. Because you do have an overlapping alliances and allegiances, and you do have external actors to Ethiopia with an interest, with a specific interest to destabilize Ethiopia, Egypt, and the Gerd issue, the Renaissance Dam issue, Sudan, and Eritrea. All of them have an interest to put fuel to the fire, so to say, in Ethiopia today. So I think it rests upon a huge responsibility on both the federal government and the regional governments in Ethiopia and all political actors to really be mature and to really try to seek out compromises, to seek out a consensus on the way forward. You know, I think Ethiopian people and the people of the Horn of Africa are way too experienced, way too accustomed with war and conflict. Throughout every generation, you have had major conflicts, major wars. And it's a tragedy if this will again lead to a new conflict scenario in Ethiopia and the Horn. Sadly enough, when we follow the historical trajectories, and we also, when we look upon it in a more comparative political viewpoint, it is often so that you have a recurrency, you relapse into conflict more often than managing to establish a sustainable peace trajectory. And it's a complicated and complex context leading to that. But one of the core issues is the fact that politicians are accustomed to use the tools they have, tools which have been tested, solutions which have been tested earlier. And in Ethiopia, conflict and war is one of the prime tools of politicians throughout the last regimes, throughout the last generations. So it is easy to revert back to that. And I think that is the cycle which needs to be broken in Ethiopia, because you only have victims if Ethiopia turns into a new conflict scenario. You don't have any victors. And the fact is that the current scenario, with the current constitutional setup, and with the interest from regional states versus federal government, you do have a potential of a disintegration of the Ethiopian state as we know it. That you do have the exit clause in the constitution, and already you have regional states as Tigray, where you have a discourse of independence, and possibly also other regional states would argue that if the country turns into instability. And I think you cannot be, it needs the utmost attention from all responsible political leaders at all levels of statehood in Ethiopia to change the trajectory we see today, to change it to a more compromise, consensus-driven trajectory, which can mitigate and pacify the conflicts we see on the horizon.
The new Prime Minister have been awarded a Nobel Prize. That gave him, in my opinion, unwarranted self-confidence and a pat on the back to do whatever he likes. And this time around, since the EPRDF took over the country and established regional states, people have their own regional governments. And if anyone, including the government, the federal government, try to take away these rights and civil war erupts, what is the chances of survival as a country? Do you think the people will say okay and they will say amen to anything Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed say, or would they say, okay, I've had enough, I'm done? What are the chances of Ethiopia existing or surviving this conflict, if and when conflict erupts?
Well, you are putting your finger on a concrete and realistic issue here, that this is not only about winning a potential political conflict in Ethiopia or winning a potential civil war. This is about, if it goes in that direction, the worst case scenario, it is about the disintegration of Ethiopia. And we know there are movements and forces which would like that to happen, both internally in Ethiopia, but also externally. And I think exactly that point, that we see the whole Ethiopia at a crossroads, should again increase the concern of all participants in this process, of all actors in this process. There are an increasing, more and more people, as far as I experience, use the term the Ethiopian Empire. And in the theory of empires, if you characterize Ethiopia as an empire, you have now the decline and potential fall of the Ethiopian Empire we are facing, and that should that should really be considered carefully. And again, I'm not arguing that Ethiopia is an empire or that we see that decline and potential disintegration now. But I listened to voices from several positions in Ethiopia drawing upon that narrative, or using that narrative, using that discourse to argue their case.
Right.
And then you come to a point where you have this sociological self-fulfilling prophecy, suddenly that will be the mainstream interpretation of Ethiopia, if that is left unabated. And I think, you mentioned the fact that you have responsible politicians in Ethiopia, hopefully, and more or less the whole political elite in Ethiopia are personally experienced with warfare, with the terrible actions and terrible experiences endured during conflict in the battlefields and trenches of Ethiopia during the last 20, 30 years. So they should themselves know that conflict and war doesn't solve the political discords we see in the country today. And hopefully also that will lead them to change the focus and to see that, an armed conflict, an armed confrontation will just lead to victims and no victors. So we'll see, and it's also up to, of course, the Ethiopian people to from all regional states to demand accountability from the political leaders, to demand peace, to demand reconciliation, to demand compromise in the way forward, not to support a polarization, not to support and to build trenches, so to say, but to build bridges and to ask for dialogue in the way forward.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, Professor, for being available and spending a very expensive and very busy time. I really appreciate it. We will keep in touch. Thank you
You're welcome.
so much.
Thank you, Sulumika. Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. كبرات ناي تግራይ ኦንላይን ተኸታተልቲ ሎማዓንቲ ሒዝና لكم ቀሪብና ዝነበርና መደብ ኢትዮጵያውያን ዘይኮኑ ሰባት ፈላጣት ምሁራት ነቲ ኣብ ኢትዮጵያ ተፈጢሩ ዘሎ ናይ ሕገ መንግስትን ናይ ፖለቲካን ቅልውላው ብኸመይ ይርእዎ ነቲ ናይ ኢትዮጵያ ቀውሲ እንታይ ይርእዎ ኣሎ ብምንታይ መልክዕ ይርእዎ ኣሎ ዝብል ከም መስትያት ንሳቶም ዝህብዎ ርእይቶታት ከም መስትያት ኮይኑ ከንጻባርቀልና ኢና ፈቲና እሞ ናይ ሎማዓንቲ መደብና ኣብዚ ኣኽትውዳ እያ ኣብ ዝቕጽል ቪድዮና ክሳዕ ንራኸብ ድሓን ቀኒዩ ሳብስክራይብ ግናግበርኩም ተሓባብሩና ድሓን ኩኑ